Everybody, I'm Marisa, and I'm here live with Richard Farley. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
So, Richard, before we do a deep dive into your new book, Drop Dead, and your entire life, pretty much, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a lawyer who
Mm-hmm.
practices in New York representing financial institutions,
Mm-hmm.
Wall Street banks, debt funds, and the like. And I have a particular interest in financial catastrophes because I find them to be fascinating and really windows into what's going on in so many areas of life at the time and how relatable those historical events are to contemporary events. So I started with the stock market crash of 1929, my first a book. The second book was really a crisis that was not as well reported, which was the back office crisis on Wall Street from 1968 to 1970, where more investment banks failed than during the Great Depression. And the most recent
Yep.
is the 1975 New York City fiscal crisis. Uh,
So, that is the subject of your book,
it
Drop Dead,
is
which we're going to
correct.
be talking about today. Drop Dead: How a Coterie of Corrupt Politicians, Bankers, Lawyers, Spinmeisters, and Mobsters Bankrupted New York got bailed out, blamed the president, and went back to business as usual. And it might be happening again. So tell us what exactly happened in 1975.
Well, in 1975, the shenanigans and the games and all of the budgetary devices that really allowed the city to deficit spend, which it's not legally supposed to be able to do, by the way. There are laws that say that cities are not allowed to have deficits and aren't allowed to borrow to fund operating expenses. You're only supposed to borrow to fund capital assets like schools, bridges, et cetera. And any borrowing you do for operating expenses needs to get repaid in the same fiscal year. Obviously, revenues are lumpy, right? Your taxes are due on April 15th, your water bills due on. So the expenses are roughly even, but
Mhm.
the revenues are lumpy. So they are allowed to borrow for short periods of time to smooth over that lumpiness. And of course,
Mhm.
that, among other things, they abused flagrantly. Now, what caused them to have to deficit spend? Well, the first is you had a loss of middle income jobs in New York City over the course of the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s. You had manufacturing jobs that went to first the suburbs, then down south, and then overseas. So, loss of good paying jobs. The second thing you had was a national recession in 1973 74, which
Mhm.
disproportionately affected the northern and midwestern industrial cities like New York. The third thing you had was a massive reduction in federal aid from Washington. When the Lyndon Johnson administration left town and the Nixon administration, Ford administration came in, there was a reduction in aid to urban areas.
Why is
Uh,
that,
you
though? Why is that?
uh, because really a change in priorities.
Mm-hmm.
The urban renewal and war on poverty policies of LBJ were thought by many to be ineffective,
Mm-hmm.
particularly many Republicans. And Nixon thought that that sort of welfare spending was probably not the way to eliminate poverty. And it was also a function of rising deficits and rising interest rates. It's more expensive for the federal government to do all these things.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and inflation, rising interest rates wreak havoc on municipal budgets. That was another factor that caused the city to reach this crisis point. Remember, if I can borrow at 1, 2, 3%, I can run up the bill and borrow for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it
Mm-hmm.
becomes 10, 11, 12%, it's very hard to do that. The interest catches up with you pretty quickly. And
Right.
that's essentially what happened in the early 70s. When you incur debt you're not supposed to, you can mask it in a low interest rate environment, much harder to do in a higher interest rate environment. So basically speaking, those, and also you had a huge influx in New York City over the same period of time of unskilled, uneducated workforce people who, mostly from the South and also from Puerto Rico, who were consumers, net consumers of government services, as opposed to net contributors in terms of taxes paid. So all of this created a perfect storm in 1975 when the city nearly ran out of money, and precipitated by a downgrade by the rating agencies and Wall Street investment banks no longer agreeing to roll over the debt.
So why did Wall Street no longer agree to roll over the debt?
Because they couldn't resell it.
Okay.
And the amount of unsold municipal bonds on the books of the banks was getting to a point where the banking regulators were going to say, hey, you have a concentration problem. You have all this New York City debt on your balance sheet. If there's a problem in New York City, you're going to have a problem that the FDIC and the Fed are going to have to deal with. So
Mm,
they were
okay.
concerned that it was reaching that level. I think up to, at one point, 25% for certain banks of their net equity capital was represented by New York City debt, which is a big number.
Wow. What's the number now, do you think,
I
in New York?
don't know. I think a lot lower.
Uh-huh.
I think a lot lower.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the issue that you face is, once concern, some people might call it panic, sets
Mm-hmm.
in, then any price is not enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm buying your short-term debt, I think I'm going to get my money back within the next year, but there's a concern that you won't be able to roll over that debt. My short-term debt's now long-term debt.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm counting on that to pay my bills this year, it's a big deal if you don't pay me back when due. If I say to you, look, could I borrow 10,000, and you're like, fine, but I need it back by the end of the year so I can pay my taxes. If you don't think I'm good for it, you're not going to give me the money because you need
Right,
that
right.
money back for it. Right. So it's the same concept
Uh-huh.
in corporate and municipal borrowing.
So it's interesting, though, that you say that this was, the perfect storm and there was a lot of corruption. Where was the corruption coming from?
Well, it was coming from all over, as
Mm-hmm.
I detail in a couple of the chapters in the book. The first is they were corrupt in their budgeting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if I historically collect 85% of the real estate tax bills, some people
Mm-hmm.
are bankrupt, some people can't pay, some people dispute it, but I, in my budget, take the position that it's going to be paid 100% of the tax bill. That's not good faith because I know it's historically it's always 85 to 90. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If the Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement that I sent down to Washington is only reimbursed historically at a 95% rate, and I claim 100% for my budget, that's obviously not in good faith.
Mm-hmm.
If I send tax bills out to churches and embassies, and include those as good receivables, even though they're not subject to real estate taxes, that's fraud. But that's what they did. If I'm not supposed to borrow for short-term expenses, right? Only
Mm-hmm.
borrow for long-term assets. And I do things like saying, gee, teacher training is good over the entire lifetime of a teacher's career. Therefore, I should be able to borrow against that because that's a capital asset, isn't it? Well, people
Wait,
say, no, you couldn't.
teacher
Yes,
training?
they deemed, and they went to Albany and got
Mm-hmm.
Nelson Rockefeller and the legislature to pass a law saying this is conclusively agreed that, I think it was 10% of teacher salaries will be deemed to be teacher training, a 30-year asset, go down to Wall Street and issue a bond that is backed by that asset. And they did it. It's fraud.
That's total. I mean, anybody would know that that was fake.
Right. So you have fake debt. You
Mm-hmm.
have a budget that's not in good faith, that you're not going to meet. And
Mm-hmm.
then you do things like issue debt to do sweetheart deals. For example, When the Pennsylvania Railroad went broke, they owned the Long Island Railroad. Citibank had a $50 million loan, which in those days was a lot of money, out to the Long Island Railroad, that they were not going to get paid. They'd get, like cents on the dollar
Mm-hmm.
in the bankruptcy court. But they convinced New York State to buy the Pennsylvania the Long Island Railroad from the Pennsylvania Railroad for 50 million, so Citibank could get paid. It
Hmm.
turned out that that railroad was worth a negative 60 million
Oh my
because of
God.
because of all of the upgrades that had to be done so that the trains didn't go flying off the tracks.
Wow.
But nonetheless, the money was borrowed, and the bonds were issued, and the money was given to Citibank. So there are all kinds of sweetheart deals. Unions, right?
Mm-hmm.
What the unions realized after they got collective bargaining in the mid 1950s was that if you count all the votes of the New York City public employee unions and their spouses, that's enough that's enough votes to elect the mayor candidate in any Democratic primary. And then, as now, the Democratic primary is almost tantamount to election. So
Mm-hmm.
they realized they had enormous power by the mid 60s. So what
Mm-hmm.
happened? Well, the pensions went up, the amount of time to vest went down, work rules got more favorable. And over time, the expense of all that became an incredible burden.
It's so interesting. So you name a lot of people though who are in on the corruption.
Correct.
Like, okay, like wily politicians like House Majority Leader Tip O'Neill, New York Governor Hugh Carey, the craftiest spinmeister of them all, PR master John Scanlon. Okay, like,
Yes.
so what did they have to do with all of this?
Sure. Okay. Hugh Carey happened to be governor at the time. He was actually probably one of the least responsible for it because he
Okay.
had spent his entire career in terms of what he did in public life as a congressman in Washington, unrelated to what the city and the state. If New York City was the biggest abuser of debt and manipulating the budget, New York State was a close second. Nelson
Really?
Rockefeller was a terrible spendthrift, and he came up with something known as the moral obligation bond. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
which is a
What is that?
wonderful little device.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Before the moral obligation bond, if a state wanted to issue debt or a city, it had to get a referendum from voters saying, we approve the bond issue. Or you had to issue what was called agency debt. An agency debt was, think of a bridge or a toll road. You would only raise money that the revenues from that project, that bridge, that tunnel, what have you, would repay the debt. So there was a discipline there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the private investors in that age, the Port Authority bonds, they're going to make sure they're going to get repaid. So they're going to look at studies as to how many cars cross the bridge, and you do the math, make sure the tolls are set right, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Nelson Rockefeller wanted to build an incredible amount of middle class housing and working class housing, and then later in '68, housing for the impoverished. But to go and incur all that debt would be a real burden, and taxpayers were not going to approve it. So he came up with a housing authority, he came up with more than one.
Mm-hmm.
And when when the bankers did the calculation of what the rents would support, there's no way the numbers would work. So John Mitchell, who later became the attorney general under Richard Nixon, went to prison because of his Watergate involvement. He
Right,
came
right.
up with the brilliant idea of saying, look, why don't we say we'll build the housing, and if the rents aren't enough to pay for the bonds, the interest and principal, you agree to submit a bill to the legislature to have them make up the difference. So you have a moral obligation to have the state pay the deficit on those bonds, not a legal obligation.
So
And the
what's the
bank,
difference though? I don't, what's the difference
because
though?
the legislature can vote it down, because the assembly and the Senate can say, oh, okay, Governor Rockefeller, thank you for
Mhm.
submitting this bill. No thanks.
Okay.
Now, the problem with doing that is the bonds are already issued, and the rating agencies are going to punish the state that doesn't make good on it by ratings downgrades. Your debt incurrence costs going forward are going to be so much higher. So it really is a gun to the head of the legislature, right? You've already
Mm-hmm.
borrowed the money. Oh, you're
Right.
not going to repay it? Okay, fine. We're going to hold you responsible. So it was really it was a very smart maneuver to get around the right of taxpayers to approve bond issuances.
Hmm.
And
That's very wily.
New York went hog wild in the 60s and 70s. New York State on moral obligation debt, and it came back. It blew up uh, in January of 1975, right when the problems in New York City, and contributed to the problems. Remember, we said the banks would no longer roll over the debt. Well,
Right.
when New York State defaulted, which they did on an issue of moral obligation bonds, all of a sudden the municipal bond buyers and underwriters are saying, well, let's be careful with New York here because they're not making good on their moral obligation, which they didn't. It took them about 6 months to ultimately come up with a plan that was acceptable to the legislature and the banks.
So it's kind of like a domino effect in a way, isn't it?
Correct. Absolutely.
Interesting.
It's like
So,
dumping your boyfriend, right? The first time he comes home drunk, you put up with it. After a while, you've had enough. No more, get out.
right.
You,
So
you
you
throw
get
his
a
clothes on
divorce
the front
or,
lawn.
yeah, yeah.
And
Okay.
in April of 1975, the bankers and the municipal bond buyers threw New York's clothes on the front lawn and said, get out.
Wow. Um, so interesting. And you say that, okay, okay, in the city's darkest hour, a union leader heroically bailed the city out by loaning pension funds to save the day and
Oh,
avoid.
right. No, yeah, one of the great things about the story, now that's just a backdrop to sort of get
Okay.
into, okay, you now can't roll over your debt. You have a crisis at hand. Um, the first stop on the train is to Albany, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody has to make sure the bills get paid. And New York City is half of New York State in terms of population and spending. So Governor Carey, despite having the problems with the Rockefeller debt that was issued now in default, he's now got New York City as a problem.
Right.
And he advances the city education funds that would be payable months later to keep things rolling along until a solution could be met. And the solution, everybody knew from day one, was Washington's going to have to bail us out. Okay.
And right. And that's when
And
Ford said drop dead.
well, right, that happened in November, but
Okay.
this over Memorial Day weekend,
Mm-hmm.
it became clear that the state was going to have to assume much more of the responsibility to roll over the city's short-term debt that was coming due. So they came up with something called the Municipal Assistance Corporation, the Big Mac. I'm sure you've heard of that. And
Yep.
that was supposed to issue 3 billion of long-term debt. It was a state agency that had certain city taxes pledged to it and also had the moral obligation of the state, right? More moral
Mm-hmm.
obligation debt. And that was supposed to, as the short-term debt became due over 75, that would be repaid with long-term debt of the Municipal Assistance Corporation. The problem was the market didn't buy the debt of the Municipal Assistance Corporation. They sold one of the 3 a billion they were supposed to sell, and then they couldn't sell anymore. So it was basically a disaster. Even though Felix Roden claimed he saved the city through the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which of course was a failure. One of the many spins. Now, the union leaders decided that if the city were to file bankruptcy, okay, then a federal judge would rewrite the union contracts. That was a risk. So they didn't
Mm-hmm.
want a bankruptcy. The
Mm-hmm.
politicians didn't want a bankruptcy because then a federal judge goes through and looks at all these sweetheart deals and people get indicted. So they didn't want any of that either. So it
Mm-hmm.
was in everybody's, all the insiders' interest to come up with a consensual restructuring, getting as much money from Washington as possible. Okay. Now in Washington, you had huge Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. Because remember, 1974 was the Watergate midterm, where the
Mm-hmm.
Democrats had massive majorities. But you still had Ford in the White House. Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
Ford, who promised Nixon he wouldn't run for president, one of the reasons why Nixon chose him as vice president when Agnew had to resign, changed his mind, decided he actually kind of liked living in the White House.
I'm
And
sure.
he was going to run for president in 1976.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew he had to win New York State to win the election in 1976. And Jimmy
Ah,
Carter knew he had to win. New York State was a swing state in 1970.
mhm,
Of course, no longer. It's, you
right.
could do all kinds of horrific things and get elected as a Democrat for president in New York. But back in those days, it was swing state.
Hmm.
And Ford had to win New York State. The winner of New York State, and it was the second largest electoral prize after California. Of course, New
Oh,
York's now
really?
lost electoral votes,
Hmm.
and you have Texas and Florida and California are, equally or more important.
Thank
But
God.
back then, it was after California the largest pool of electoral votes. So Ford could not afford to lose New York State. So you say to yourself, well, why wasn't this, a very easy thing? Go down there, get your bail, and everybody go home. Well, there was a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan who was running for president in 1976, challenging Ford in the primaries.
Hmm.
And Reagan was conservative. And Reagan was saying, don't give New York the money. When will they learn? They've got to live within their means. This is like giving heroin to a heroin addict if you give them this money.
Did he really
So,
say that?
yeah.
Wow.
So Ford had a very tight rope to walk. Okay.
Hmm.
If he was too harsh on New York State, the New York Republicans might back Ford, Reagan.
Hmm.
If he were too lenient on New York State, he might lose Republicans all over the country.
Hmm.
So he had to make this, a very delicate maneuver to get to a satisfactory outcome. Tip O'Neill knew Ford was going to run for president because he was very close to Ford. They were close friends from the House of Representatives. Ford was the House minority leader when Tip O'Neill was the majority leader. So they dealt
So
with each other all the time.
that's interesting because Tip O'Neill is a Democrat, right? He was
Correct.
a Democrat, and Ford's a Republican. So back in the days, they were actually friends,
Well,
not now.
everyone talks about how Reagan and Tip O'Neill were close friends. They really weren't. If you read
Hmm.
Tip O'Neill's memoir, Man of the House, he destroys Reagan and calls him dumb.
Oh,
He did
really?
not really like Reagan. This is a myth of the press that Reagan and Tip O'Neill were pals after hours. Not really. But
Hmm.
Gerald Ford and Tip O'Neill were very close friends.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting. That's an interesting backstory,
yeah.
actually.
So Tip O'Neill could tell by the way Ford was acting that he was going to run.
Hmm.
So he said to Hugh Carey, so there's an irony there as well. When Hugh Carey was in the House of Representatives, he was supposed to be the next in line to get the majority whip slot. But Hugh Carey was not everybody's friend. A lot of people a lot of people in the Democratic caucus didn't like Hugh Carey. He was
Hmm.
arrogant, he was rich, he was temperamental. So certain members of the New York delegation went to Speaker Carl Alpert and said, if you make Hugh the whip, we're not going to support you.
Hmm. Okay.
So they said, well, who's next in line after Carey? Well, it's Tip O'Neill. So Tip got the leadership role that was supposed to go to Hugh Carey, and Tip always felt bad about that because he thought Hugh got a raw deal. So fast forward a few years to 75, Tip's going to do everything he can to help Hugh Carey because he feels that, Hugh was dealt a bad hand by certain of his colleagues in New York. So Tip O'Neill came up with a strategy that basically said, look, if there's not a deal with Ford by Thanksgiving, Ford is going to have a crisis because if this slips into the holidays, he runs the risk of alienating the New York Republicans who might bolt and go to Reagan. So if
Hmm.
you can find enough money through all these pockets to keep the city afloat through Thanksgiving, Ford will cave. And create as much press around the event as possible because Ford doesn't want this to be focused on in the Republican process. Because
Hmm.
the more scrutiny of what he's doing to bail out New York, the more it's going to help Reagan with the conservatives nationwide.
So
So that,
interesting how that works, though.
right. So the unions, okay.
Hmm.
The unions lent the city a significant amount of money to tide the city over out of their pension funds, which seems like a selfless act, except the obligation of the state and the city to pay those pensions is completely irrelevant to whether there's any money in the pension funds. So if
So
New
what does
York
that
City,
mean?
okay, let's assume there's 20 billion of pension money in a New York City public employee fund.
Mm-hmm.
If that goes to zero because they piss it away on terrible investments,
Mm-hmm.
New York City is still obligated to pay retirees the pensions.
Okay.
It's in the state constitution.
All right.
So, it sort of sleeves off the vest. If I loan you the money and you don't pay me back, you're still going to pay the pensions.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not really an enormous sacrifice. The
Right.
other thing they didn't say is prior to the early 60s, the city pension funds held 80% of their assets in New York City bonds, which is
Hmm.
stupid because New York City bonds are tax free and pension funds don't pay taxes. So you get a lower rate of interest. But it was another form of corruption, right? I can borrow from the pension funds cheaper than the market, which means I can spend more of the taxpayers' money.
Wow. Okay.
Abe Beam, actually, was one good thing Abe Beam did as controller, is he said, this is nuts. We should be investing in taxable securities with higher interest rates because we don't have to pay taxes, right? It's common sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a deal for the teachers union to subscribe to a loan to the city. And the teachers union had a contract negotiated with the Board of Ed. But as we get into September, the Municipal Assistance Corporation can't sell the bonds. New York State is paying more of the city's obligations. They came up with something called a control board, state imposed, that said we get to review every major contract that the city is engaged in. We get to appoint a controller to see where the money's going. More state oversight. And one of the first acts of that board, maybe it was symbolic, maybe it was substantive, was to reject the teacher's contract and say it's
Oh,
too expensive.
the teacher's contract where they said they needed tutors, that one?
No. This
Um,
was just the normal teacher's contract
okay.
for a certain percent of salary increase, certain percent of change in work rule. A
Okay.
normal teachers went on strike for about 3 days. They reached a deal, but the deal had to be approved by the state oversight board, which
Mm-hmm.
rejected it. And after it rejected it, the teachers union said, well, that's fine, then we're not going to make that loan that we promised you. And that
Hmm.
precipitated a crisis. But it really was not the crisis it was made out to be, because Abe
Mm-hmm.
Beam called up the firefighters and the cops, and they said, well, if they don't loan you the money, we'll loan you their share, and it'll all work out.
Wait, so
So,
this is kind of crazy. So the teachers, the deal is pending on is hinged on the teachers. They go on strike, and then the firemen step up.
well, when the teachers union was rejected by the control board, they
Mm-hmm.
said, well, two can play this game. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
renege on our promise to make that loan that we're
Okay.
obligated to do.
Mm-hmm.
This precipitated a liquidity problem because they needed the money like in a few days.
Wow.
But the firemen's union and the other union said, if the teachers don't subscribe for that portion they agreed to, we'll take up their share so that the
Mm-hmm.
city doesn't have, actually run out of money.
So
Because
what's in it
remember,
for
this
them?
is what's that?
What's in it for them if they do that?
So that
The
the city doesn't have to file bankruptcy and all their contracts get rewritten and their pensions get reduced.
Okay, so I just wanted to find out
Right, because if
what.
you actually run out of, if the city
Mm-hmm.
runs out of money and the federal
Mm-hmm.
government doesn't bail them out, you got to do something, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because you can't have chaos in the streets. If you don't pay the firemen and the policemen, they're not going to show up to work,
Right.
right? If
Okay.
elderly people don't get their welfare checks and start freezing in the projects, if you're mayor, you got a major problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they
Right.
had to
So.
come up with something.
Mm-hmm.
And if you file bankruptcy, which then all the creditors have to stand pat, and then you can borrow on a priming basis, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
do that, but then a bankruptcy judge goes through and says, I'm going to rejigger your liabilities. And one of the biggest liabilities of any municipality is its pension obligations. And the teachers did not want a federal bankruptcy judge reducing their pension benefits. So it was in everybody's interest to kick the can down the road.
Interesting. So interesting how one crisis can lead to another crisis and another crisis and another crisis. So
Yep.
then what happened?
Okay, so now we get into the teachers' strike was in September. It was resolved. Now we get into October.
Mm-hmm.
And it is really starting to get problematic. Um, Carrie finds money, it's like almost like going underneath the sofa cushions looking for coins. But somehow
Mm-hmm.
they keep getting the money. The banks give them a little more. The unions give a little more. But now they're coming down to the end of the road. And um, there was a meeting at the Rockefeller estate up in Westchester where the Secretary of the Treasury, Nixon's Ford Secretary of the Treasury, Bill Simon, who, by the way, ran the municipal bond desk of Salomon Brothers before he became Treasury Secretary and made millions issuing these bonds that were, not good bonds. But
Wow.
just another irony. Um, and the New York State legislative leaders sat down with Simon and Nelson Rockefeller and his brother, who ran Chase Manhattan Bank, and said, "Guys, if the federal government doesn't cut a deal here, New York is actually going to run out of money, and you're going to lose the 1976 election." Okay, so
So, okay. So were those three like among the most corrupt?
I wouldn't say corrupt. They were. No, I wouldn't say that they were among the most corrupt, at least not egregiously. So you had a corrupt system, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's hard to say. I mean, Nelson Rockefeller was he was fiscally irresponsible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
His brother David, I don't think he was corrupt. He was in the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Bill Simon, you could argue he made money off of the
The
city's corruption,
bonds. Mm-hmm.
which he did,
Mm-hmm.
and was now the Secretary of Treasury for Ford, and taking the view that the city is, the heroin addict in need of, cold turkey. So there
Wow.
was a little bit of performative behavior. But
Okay.
there was this meeting in October where they said, look, you got to reach a deal or you're going to have a problem and you're going to lose New York State. And, Ronald Reagan may be the nominee, guys, which isn't good for any of us. And
Mm-hmm.
Nelson, who always wanted to be president, he thought this was the greatest thing. When he was appointed by Ford to be the vice president, when Ford became president after Nixon's resignation, he's like, well, wait a minute, Ford's telling everybody he's not going to run. That means I'm the vice president in 1976 who can
Mm-hmm.
run. He had
Right.
dreams of a Rockefeller presidency. Remember, he ran twice before and lost.
I didn't
So
know that.
yeah, so he still thought 1980 might be his year.
Mm-hmm.
So this was all, very important to resolve this New York crisis effectively and reasonably quietly, because it didn't turn out that way. So
Mm-hmm.
Ford finally agrees he's going to give the city money. Okay. And he picks, because he heard back from Simon and Nelson Rockefeller, that it's reaching the crisis point. It's time to concede. So he
Mm-hmm.
picks a speech at the National Press Club where he basically says, I will give the city money, but my conditions are they've got to default on their debt and face the consequences of default and do a bankruptcy filing, and then we'll come in with the money. Now, that was the start of negotiations, because remember, he's got to keep
Mm-hmm.
the Reagan people happy. People
Mm-hmm.
might go to Reagan. He was going to
Right.
drop the bankruptcy requirement anyway, because one of the key conditions that Carrie had said after that meeting was, we're not going to file a bankruptcy. We know you're not going to agree to it on day one, but when this gets finally done, and they were negotiating behind the scenes from
Mm-hmm.
mid-October all the way to December, when the law was ultimately passed, providing for the bailout. After that speech, here's where the press manipulation came in.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what Ford said, it was going to be spun in the papers, which then as now are overwhelmingly Democratic, was going to be spun in the papers as the most draconian, horrible punishment on New York City, that these right-wing fanatics are trying to destroy the great progressive melting pot, gorgeous mosaic of New York City. And the
Mm-hmm.
fellow who came up with that strategy and implemented brilliantly was a man by the name of John Scanlon, who was sort of
Okay.
a
Yeah.
legendary New York PR guy.
Okay.
You've heard of the artist and writers softball game in East Hampton?
Yeah.
And that was his thing, right? He was very
Oh,
smart.
really?
He said,
Okay.
if I control who gets to play and everyone can brag about where they play and they're now a big shot, that was one of his maneuvers of power and influence. But he also represented Drexel Burnham when they were indicted. He represented Jesse Jackson when he had the illegitimate child. He represented a lot of Catholic organizations when there was the pedophilia scandals. He
Wow.
represented the tobacco companies when they were found to be making the cigarettes more addictive. So Scanlon was not, and his first client was a major mobster named Anthony Scotto. You've heard of Fresco by Scotto?
I'm
Their
friends. Well, we're
father,
friends with, you know, Roseanne.
Rosanna's father, was Anthony
Yeah.
Scotto, who was a
Right.
Gambino crime figure, and he
Mm.
ran the docks in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And that was John Scanlon's first client. And
Wow.
Scanlon came up with a brilliant strategy. He said, well, look, you know, Anthony Scotto's handsome. His wife's gorgeous. He's articulate. He looks like a banker. He dresses like a banker. We're going
Hmm.
to make him a pillar of the New York establishment. And he's not going to look or act like a gangster. So no one's going to think he's a gangster. And that's exactly what he did. And it worked out. You know, he
You
was
know,
on the
it's
board of the Brooklyn Academy of Music.
wow.
He's running around with Lee Radziwill and Jackie Onassis. I mean, he was a society figure. He and his wife.
So interesting how perception really
Right.
dictates
So Drop
what people
Dead, the
believe.
headline, Ford to City, Drop Dead, was part of this media manipulation campaign to keep the
Hmm.
pressure on Ford to provide the money to the city on more favorable terms.
So
And it
that was
worked brilliantly.
Scanlon. Scanlon
John
did that.
Scanlon, correct. Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a brilliant strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. It was absolutely brilliant. And it worked. And the truth of the matter, shows you how dumb the Republicans were in those days. They had no media rollout strategy after Ford's speech. Ford just gave the
So,
speech. He assumed that the press was going to report it on the level, and you did be a back and forth with the New York politicians, A. Beam and Hugh Carey, and
mhm,
we'll reach a deal. And he
right.
got completely steamrolled. And Carey had a nationwide, basically, book tour to promote his side of what the bailout ought to be all across the country, while Ford and the administrations caught flat-footed. And ultimately, the deal they got was a very good deal for New York City and New York State.
The deal that Carrie got, and
Yes, they
okay,
basically got all of the short-term debt needs of the city for the next 3 years would be provided by the federal government.
wow.
And then the long-term debt that was a
Hmm.
problem,
Hmm.
that was bailed out in 1978 by Jimmy Carter and the Democratic Congress. But there was no drama because everybody was everybody was in favor of it. So there were
So,
two bailouts.
so these bailouts, they were kind of a grift, though, weren't they?
Of course, because there was
Hmm.
no reform. Okay.
Hmm.
If you look at what the average union employee made in 75 versus 78, they
Hmm.
had done much better than inflation in those 3 years. There was no
Hmm.
reform. The people who suffered were the retarded children, the poor people who lost the community x-rays and the community hospitals. It's always the poorest people who don't have lobbyists, who don't have a union, who end up suffering when there's a reckoning of a fiscal crisis. It's the poorest of the poor who pay. It's not going to be the union people. It's not going to be those who can afford a lobbyist. It's not going to be the real estate interests. It is the poor who disproportionately suffer. And that
Well, of
happened
course.
in the 70s, and it'll happen again.
So, okay. I mean, this is really the way the world works.
Hmm.
So,
Correct.
Richard, let's go from 1975, right? And flash forward to what's happening in New York right now.
Correct. Now, there's a
You're
miracle that happened. There was a miracle that happened in about 1978. Okay.
okay.
There was a fellow in a building at Avenue of the Stars in Los Angeles who came
Hmm.
up with a product known as the junk bond. Okay. And that transformed Wall Street. It created the private equity industry. And all of a sudden, beginning in the late 1970s, continuing through now, you had a tsunami of revenue in the financial services industry. And as a share of the economy, it grew disproportionately. And New
Hmm.
York got the lion's share of that revenue. Okay. So the city went from really wondering how it's going to pay its bills in the late 70s through this new golden age, which I think ended in some ways when Mayor Bloomberg left. But you had an enormous tax base created by that industry. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then COVID comes. And what do we all learn during COVID? Well, we're doing
Not to
this.
trust the government.
What we're doing here on Restream, this didn't exist before COVID. Nobody would think of doing an interview over
Mhm.
a Zoom-like technology. But all
Okay,
of a
true.
sudden now we all learn that there's Zoom, we can work from home. I
Mm-hmm.
can be a lawyer, you can be a banker. We don't have to be in New York City. We can do our jobs anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So what
Okay.
we've seen since COVID
Mm-hmm.
is jobs in the financial industry in New York have remained flat. Actually, this year, for the first time ever in a non-bear market, the
Mm-hmm.
financial industry jobs are going down.
Oh,
The
really?
job growth of the financial services in Florida and Texas are exploding.
So why
Okay.
don't you move to Florida?
Why don't I move to Florida? Because as a lawyer, I'm New York admitted, and most
Okay.
contracts in financial products are governed by New York law. So
Okay.
I have to practice in New York State. Doesn't mean I have to be
Mm-hmm.
in New York City. And this may
Mm-hmm.
change. In
Mm-hmm.
20 years, people may say, look, why are we wedded to New York law?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, things, the legal niceties follow the economic realities.
Okay.
And there's a real risk that New York loses its primacy, I think, in financial service, at least has it significantly diminished
Mm-hmm.
if you make New York not such a nice place for people who work in that industry to live and work. And
So
that
let's,
brings us to where we are right
yes.
now.
Okay, yeah, because that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Hmm.
So, I mean, you were prescient in this book, and you predicted what was going to happen even before Mamdani got on the scene. So, what
Actually,
is?
the book came out, I think, 7 weeks before he won the primary.
Oh, really?
If there's a second edition, I'm going to dedicate it to him.
You should. So, what do you think is going to happen here? What's going to happen
Well,
to New York?
remember we talked right at the start about the factors that led to the crisis.
Right,
Okay, we've had, we're losing the financial services jobs. Okay,
right.
now that's just a trickle of loss. Now there's
Mm-hmm.
no gain; it's a loss. If that becomes a precipitous loss,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you're going to have a major problem.
Mm-hmm.
We have rising interest rates, right? No one's expecting interest rates to go back to what they were, from the financial crisis through COVID. That's over.
Mm-hmm.
We're going back to historically normal rate for interest. More expensive for cities to issue debt. Okay. We've had a massive influx of net consumers of government services. It's called illegal immigration during the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and many, many tens of thousands of those folks ended up in New York City. They're low skilled. They're going to be consumers of services, and a net loss from a tax base perspective. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to have, I guarantee you, over the remaining years of the Trump administration, a meaningful, perhaps even more so than in the 70s under the Nixon Ford administration, a meaningful reduction in aid from Washington to New York City. Guaranteed. It's already starting. Initially, it's hitting hospitals and Medicaid and Medicare. It is going to become more of a crisis as time goes on. Um,
Is that
uh,
because that's because of Hochul and the way the New York City's run, New York State's
well, it's
run?
because you now have a Republican Congress and Senate and president,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as opposed to having, Joe Biden in there,
Mm-hmm.
in massive spending bills, whether it's COVID or Build Back Better or Green New Deal, a lot of which was just a way to get money to your friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
They always have nice names for these bills, but a lot of that money was spent to fund jobs and ordinary expenses, and
Okay.
that's now not going to be there. What we don't know is whether the shenanigans have gone on, right? You never know that until the tide goes out. Who's wearing a bathing suit,
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not there was massive waste.
Do you
Um,
think there was massive waste? I mean, it seems to me that there were a lot of shenanigans in the last
every
administration.
time I think I'm too cynical, it turns out I haven't been cynical enough.
Oh,
So
like I have a friend, Sam Gross, who he passed away last year, but he would say there's no bottom to the barrel.
Yeah,
Seems like that's the case
yeah.
here.
So time will tell. But if
Hmm.
you look at what our next mayor, and right now I think it's a foregone conclusion that Mamdani is going to be the next mayor.
You really
Um,
do? Mm,
yeah, I was speaking with a major pollster who I happened to stop on the street. I ran into him on the street yesterday, a
mhm,
brand name pollster who everyone would know. And we were
mhm.
chatting about the race. And he basically said even if Curtis Lewa gets out of the race, the numbers are such that it's basically impossible for Cuomo to beat Mondami.
But what if, I mean, like, you don't think Sliwa could pull off a win?
No, not a chance.
Not in blue New York City,
No,
right? No,
no,
never.
not a chance. Correct. He's consistently polled sort of 12 to 14.
That's too bad.
So that's where he is. And he's been adamant he's not getting out of the race. And what
Hmm.
I've heard from the administration is that Trump has now come around to the view that it'd be very helpful for him to make Mondami the face of the Democratic Party nationwide, and that
Hmm.
that'll be very helpful for the midterm elections. There are congressional seats in the suburbs around New York City that would be in play if what we think is going to happen happens in terms of Mondami's policies, which, by the way,
Hmm.
I think he's going to get through much of his agenda. There's this fantasy that a lot of business interests have in New York City that, oh, Albany will put the brakes on him. I think Albany is as progressive as he is. And I think
Wow.
Hochul is more afraid of being primaried by Tish James or some other left winger than she is running against Elise Stefanik or Bruce Blakeman in the general election.
Wow.
Um, so I think she's going to give him the vast majority of what he wants in terms of tax increases and in terms of schemes like the city-owned grocery stores. He can do that by himself, by the way. And
Mm,
this universal pre-K up to age whatever they're proposing now, 10 or something, 8 or 10. I mean, it's crazy.
it is crazy. So,
We had universal pre-K when I was a kid. It was called Grandma.
yeah, exactly. Wow. So it's so fascinating that Hochul will bend over backwards to make him happy because it's all about her career and ambition and she just wants to win.
Of
It's like
course.
everybody just wants to win. Nobody has any backbone.
Well,
Nobody
that's
has.
always been the case, though. I mean, we
Mhm.
that's like asking a shark not to bite, asking a
Right.
politician to not focus on reelection. I mean, it's
Hmm.
just a given.
Wow. So I think you're right though about Trump. I think he definitely would be so happy if Mamdani won.
Yes.
You know, so what do you think happens though? Let's
Well,
say
look,
he does win.
one of the things that caused New York City to have the fiscal problems, which we haven't talked about, is New York City did many more things in terms of services
Hmm.
in the early 1970s than New York State did. Okay.
Hmm.
For example, it had its own hospital system. No other city had a large hospital system. Had its own university system.
I didn't know
It had
that.
the city university system, CUNY.
Uh-huh.
Okay, no other city in the country had that
Wow.
until the late '60s. It ran the subways until the
Hmm.
state took it over. So it ran the courts and the prisons. Had its own courts and prisons.
Mm.
So when it took on all, and you may say, so well, why would you do that if you were bleeding red ink? It's called
Hmm.
patronage jobs. If the city runs the courts and the hospitals, etc., they can put their friends and supporters and the children, and everybody else in there. They get
So
those
basically,
jobs.
it's like you get all your people in, so you just keep all the people you don't want
Of
out.
course, of course.
Okay.
And if that's run by the state politicians get to hire the hospital administrators and the orderlies and the nurses and this and that. A lot of jobs, a lot of
Hmm.
patronage.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's
So
why the
it works
city
for
held on
everybody.
to that.
Hmm.
Um, but like running grocery stores is not a historic city function, right? Cities don't generally do that.
Hmm.
A babysitting for the entire population isn't something cities historically have done. So
Hmm.
Mondami is creeping back towards a New York City that does things that states or the private sector have
Hmm.
historically done for themselves, taking
Hmm.
on too many obligations. And very rarely does anybody say, boy, the city does this much better than the private sector could. I'm so
Yeah.
glad that we got them running things. That's generally not how this shakes out.
I can't believe people would be okay with that. What happened here? How?
Well, I think that it's very odd. If you're a student of New York City politics,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for most of our lives, you had clearly delineable constituents, right? You
Mm-hmm.
had, okay, you had the black vote, you had the Hispanic vote, you had the working class Irish and Italian vote, and you could
Mm-hmm.
pretty much decide how people were going to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
This
Mm-hmm.
time you had the white candidate win the black vote, and you had the candidate of color win the white vote.
Hmm.
And so there's a very strange thing going on here. Well, it may be a positive in that race and ethnicity are not as outcome determinative, which I think is all in all good thing. But
Mm-hmm.
understanding why Mamdani got tremendous support from white voters and Asian voters. Remember, he wants to close the gifted and talented programs, which most Asian historically families have been strongly supportive of. So
Mm-hmm.
I think you have this progressive woke element
Mm-hmm.
in the city. And remember, you've had a million working class and middle class blacks and whites leave the city, replaced by a lot of yuppies and South Asians.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that has now become its own voting bloc, right? And they're very progressive,
Very
right?
progressive.
These college educated white and Asian people who are making, low six figures, but are comfortable, nonetheless think that there ought to be a more socialist form of government.
So, what exactly
Probably
is?
because their parents have been paying for everything, right? They've never really had to pay for
Probably.
anything themselves.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah.
So, what exactly is democratic socialism? That's like, what is the definition of that?
Um,
What does that mean, really?
yeah, it means that the government provides many of the services that the private sector has done historically, and
Okay.
that maybe um, a significant portion of the economy ought to be socialized,
Mm-hmm.
um, not just grocery stores and babysitting.
You think,
Um,
according to them, they think the majority
I think
of.
they would have the entire healthcare system government run.
Mm,
I think they would have, they would do away with charter schools and vouchers and other things that create a competitive educational environment. That ought to be all government run. So their philosophy is the government does things better than the private sector because the private sector is motivated by evil, corrosive capitalism, right?
mm,
And if you look at that Marxist philosophy, they think everything evil starts with the capitalist system, right? And
mm-hmm.
everything is determined by that economic system. They
Mm-hmm.
believe, for example, that marriage, whether it's a man and woman, man and man, marriage is a capitalist institution because every institution in a capitalist where that's the economy is determined by the profit motive and capitalism. So if you believe that
Mm-hmm.
everything is determined by it, and therefore everything is corrupted and probably evil, you get to some pretty strange results. Um, but again, if you look at the, Marxism and that thought, they believe that
Mm-hmm.
and when society evolves away from capitalism, which was an improvement over mercantilism and agriculture, so they viewed it as a progression. Ultimately, you get to communism, where to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities, and we get to this utopia where there's no need for a government at all. But
Mm-hmm.
in the meantime, we need government to, control the means of production and basically be pervasive in every area of life, to transition from capitalism to this utopia. That's what they at core believe. Now,
Mm-hmm.
something happened in the 50s where you had sort of the Herbert Marcuse school. And I'm simplifying this because obviously people have written 1,000-page books on these things. But he basically said, look, Americans are too prosperous. They want football and beer and color TV and shotguns and trucks. So you're not going to have a workers' revolution in America. So
Mm-hmm.
what you need is smart people to be the vanguard. You need the universities need to produce good Marxists to show these dumb NFL watching working class people how
Rednecks, right?
oppressed they are. They
Right.
don't know they're oppressed. They
Mm-hmm.
need to have an awakening. And the
Mm-hmm.
vanguard needs to show them that. And the best way to do that is to exploit cleavages in society. Show the people that marriage is oppressive. Show them that racism is derivative from capitalism, that misogyny is derivative of capitalism, that even gender itself is a capitalist thing. There's no man, woman, this, that, and the other. It's all derived from this oppressive economic system. So if we put pressure points on all these areas, we'll unveil the evilness of the capitalist system. And then the person who watches the NFL will realize, no, I'm just an oppressed individual, and you're right. I should hand over all power to you, the vanguard, to help along the communist utopia. So that's what's happened in the universities
Mm-hmm.
in many instances. You wonder where this thinking came from. It really started in the early 60s. It didn't just happen over the last 10 years. Now, it was a small minority, the
Mm-hmm.
crazies in the humanities department, but over time, it became more and more prevalent.
So basically, I mean, that
And
this is a theory that's been going. I mean, I've been hearing
right,
this
and
a
then you
lot
have that
more
theory.
since
Well, you have to have,
indoctrination.
every
Mm-hmm.
oppressed group needs to get together
Mm-hmm.
and form coalitions and there's a word for it which I can't, it escapes me right now.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where the whole theory of victimhood,
Mm-hmm.
and why you see queers for Palestine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone has to get together and realize we're all just victims of the same capitalist oppression.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the
Yeah.
mind frame that brings about, that's the theory. The more of that, the more we get to the communist utopia
So
quicker.
it's hinging on victimhood.
Correct.
Okay, interesting. And it's
That's a
also
tool to
interesting.
get see. That's a tool to get people to see
Mm-hmm.
how oppressive the system is, right?
Wow.
And
In the
it, it,
meantime,
it, 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 it really isn't like the abusive husband's the problem. It's
right.
it's 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 the capitalist system at the end of the day.
It's so interesting that the system that will wind up controlling them is a system that they want, which is really going to oppress them.
Well, right. I mean, one thing they struggle with is to find. Now we've had Marxism around now for a couple hundred years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, no one has been able to point to the socialist or Marxist government on any level that
Mm-hmm.
that really has turned out well for its citizens. You know that
So,
that's the elephant in the room is,
mm-hmm.
it doesn't have a good track record of enforcing human rights, of economic success, of
Mm-hmm.
not resulting in the same levels of oppression and types. I don't think you wanted to be a gay or a lesbian in Albania, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the communists were not libertarian in terms of people's human and civil rights. Quite the opposite. You did not want to be a religious minority in the Soviet Union, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the track record of success of these deeply socialist or Marxist governments is quite poor.
So I mean, so what do you think's going to happen to New York? You think
I don't know what the tipping point is, right?
mm-hmm. Do you
Is it
think,
raising taxes by another 2 percentage points or
mm-hmm.
4 or 6 like Mondami wants to do, or
Mm-hmm.
8 or 10? I don't know what the tipping point is. I do know it's a lot easier for financial services jobs to leave New York City now.
Mm-hmm.
Back in
It just,
75, you
mm-hmm.
couldn't leave. You didn't have interstate branch banking. You had a New York Stock Exchange where stocks were traded. It was not done electronically. So you
Mm-hmm.
sort of had to be here in
Mm-hmm.
those days. You don't have to be here now. Now, if you said to somebody in 1960
Mm-hmm.
that Detroit, which was the wealthiest per capita city in the world in 1960,
Really? I
yes,
didn't know that.
yes,
Wow.
would have a hollowed out shell of an economy in the city, and that the auto industry would be dispersed nationwide,
Mm-hmm.
and Detroit would just be one of many places where cars are made. People would think you were crazy.
Hmm.
So the notion that it can't happen here,
Mm-hmm.
I hope you're right. I hope the people saying that are right,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm a little more fearful.
Well, if he does win, it's going to be New York South is going to be even Palm Beach, Boca, this area here.
Oh,
It's
I
already
think
going in that direction.
yeah, look, I think the long-term trends for South Florida are incredibly positive.
Mm-hmm.
I think, we've seen since COVID an enormous amount of investment and infrastructure. I think you're going to start seeing phenomenal schools, private schools. I think you're going to
Mm-hmm.
see an infrastructure that's going to get built out to accommodate maybe a doubling of the population. I know that sounds crazy, but
No, it does.
the more west you go, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you drive from Palm Beach to Wellington, there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of space there to build stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the long term de- development there is going to be quite positive.
I mean,
Um,
I'm seeing more and more people moving down here.
yes,
I mean, I moved here 2 years ago, so.
everybody can name 50 people they know who now spend at least half the year
Mm-hmm.
down
Yeah.
in South Florida. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope he doesn't win just so they stay up there.
I just don't see, obviously there are crazy things that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
But as you sit here today, there's no stopping them.
Hmm. So, Richard, what's next for you? What are you doing
Well,
next?
I'm going to take a little break and talk about the book with people like you, and I'm going to continue my day job
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully continue to advocate for sensible policy. I'm a registered Democrat, so I'm not a right winger by any stretch of the imagination. I haven't really changed.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Democratic Party in New York City that's changed
Well,
dramatically.
I know. I was a Democrat too, so,
Yep.
and it really did
Um,
change.
so my rule of thumb is I'm going to find in every election, whether it's a primary or a general election, I'm going to vote for the normal person, right? The
Mm-hmm.
person that doesn't have the crazy views. And I'm less
Mm-hmm.
concerned about the party label than I am, is this somebody with good judgment and who's got reasonable values and beliefs?
I'm with you on that. I'm going to go with the people who make the most sense.
Yep.
And yeah, I
And
mean,
if you have two candidates that makes sense, wonderful. Flip a coin.
right. Well,
Um,
let's see that happen. I don't
yeah,
know.
it doesn't happen very often. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So where are you right now? I
I'm in
see
my
the Empire
office in Midtown Manhattan.
I see the Empire State Building right
Yeah, that
behind
is
you.
the Empire State Building and the
Okay.
sunset. So, sort
Well,
of.
nice. Sort of.
Yeah,
It's nice.
the sun is, it's that time of year where it
Hmm.
starts to it gets late early around here, as Yogi Berra used to say.
So are you in the 40s, 50s area right now?
Yeah, I'm on 46th and 6th.
Okay. So you were close to Neary's, close-ish to Neary's. That
Not
great
far. It's a little
restaurant.
east and 10 blocks north. I used to live right across the street in Sutton Place.
I do you know I lived on 54th between First and Sutton.
I was on 57th between First and Sutton.
Okay, so we were neighbors.
It was lovely.
That was
And
that
Neary's was, as you know, it was the sort of cornerstone of the neighborhood.
it was. It
And
was like our dining room. It was
yeah,
so
and
great.
and Una and Jimmy and the whole family. It's a shame that it is no more.
I
Big
know.
part of New York City.
It was a huge
Uh,
part of New York City.
yeah,
There's never going to be anything like that again.
no, and a lot of
That's
those places are gone after
mhm.
COVID. And look, it's hard to make a go of it when people are only in the city 3 days a week.
Not only that, it's like, the box stores and what happened in the city, all those small businesses just shut down
And nobody
because
hangs out anymore. Everybody's going to their Pilates class at 6 in the morning, and they want to get a good sleep score on their app, and it's become a lot less fun.
I know. The days of hanging out and meeting people.
Well, I
I mean,
think what ruined it was the cell phone. Okay,
I
in
think
the
you're right
old
because
days,
everybody's scrolling.
in the
Yeah.
well, no, it's even worse than that. In the old days, if I wanted to meet you, let's say I knew I had to get to Marisa, there's something at the New York or something where I needed to get in touch with you. If I
Mhm.
call you and you're not home, I'm not just going to wait around. Everyone's, well, she goes to Neary's. So
Mhm.
you'd stop by Neary's and see if they're there.
Right, right,
And then
right.
someone said, well, no, but she usually comes in around 10 o'clock. So you sit down, you have a drink, you know, 3 or 4 people. People used to hang out,
Right.
right? If you wanted to talk to somebody, you knew where they were, the Lion's Head or Elaine's or 21 or, PJ Clark's. You knew where everybody hung out.
Mhm.
And that's it. That was your group chat, right? Your group
Right.
chat was you go to where you know they're going to be.
Mhm.
And of course, nobody
Sure.
does it anymore. I can just text you from anywhere in the world and you respond. So why should I try to go find you?
Yeah. Too bad. You know, it's like the more connected we are, the less connected we are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This went by so fast. I can't
I,
believe it's
I
over an
know.
hour at this point.
This was a really great chat. So come
Well, we'll
back
have
again
to talk
soon.
after the election in a few weeks.
Okay,
We'll recap what
definitely.
happened.
Okay, that would be great. We should definitely do that.
Terrific. Would love to.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everybody.